A city drowns in a single day, not slowly, not over years of decline or centuries of siege. One morning, people wake to familiar streets. By evening, those streets are gone. The temples, the markets, the bronze gates that gleamed in sunlight, all of it pulled beneath waves that close over everything like a fist. No survivors tell the story. No ruins remain to excavate. Just memory, filtered through generations until it becomes something else entirely. This is the story of Atlantis. But it's also the story of how humans remember catastrophe, how we shape disaster into myth and myth into meaning, how a philosopher's parable became the most famous lost city in human history, searched for in every ocean, blamed for everything from ancient technology to alien contact. The question isn't really whether Atlantis existed. The question is why we need it to. Because buried in this story, beneath centuries of speculation, pseudoscience, and treasure hunters, there might be something real, not a literal city waiting to be found, but a memory so powerful it survived the very destruction it describes. We're going to follow that memory backward, from Plato's study in ancient Athens, where the story first appeared in writing, through the archaeological detective work that connected his tale to a real volcanic eruption, to the ocean floor itself, where evidence of ancient catastrophes still waits in layers of ash and stone. This isn't a mystery with a simple answer. It's better than that. It's a story about the distance between what happened and what we remember happening, about how truth becomes legend, and legend becomes something we can't quite let go. Athens, sometime around 360 BC. Plato is in his 60s now, old enough to have seen his city lose a war, execute his teacher, and struggle to reinvent itself in the aftermath of empire. He runs a school called the Academy, where young men come to study philosophy, mathematics, and the nature of justice. He's writing dialogues. These are staged conversations. Characters debate, disagree, circle around ideas like wrestlers looking for leverage. They're teaching tools, thought experiments dressed up as drama. And in two of these dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, Plato does something unusual. He tells a story about a place that no longer exists. The story comes through a character named Critias, who claims to be recounting something his grandfather heard from Solon, who supposedly learned it from Egyptian priests during his travels. This is already a game of telephone, fourth-hand information passed down through generations. But Critias insists it's true, not metaphor, not parable, history. According to this account, there was once a powerful island nation beyond the Pillars of Heracles, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. This island was larger than Libya and Asia combined, which in Plato's geography meant a landmass of staggering size. It was called Atlantis, and it was ruled by kings descended from Poseidon himself. The city at the heart of this island was a marvel of engineering. Plato describes it in careful detail, concentric rings of water and land, connected by bridges and canals. The outermost ring was 3 stades wide. The next was 2. At the center stood a temple to Poseidon, its exterior covered in silver, its pinnacles in gold. The Atlanteans were wealthy beyond measure. They controlled trade routes, commanded vast armies, and possessed technology that seemed almost magical to their neighbors. Their ships dominated the Mediterranean. Their influence reached Egypt, Italy, Greece itself. But there was a problem at the heart of this empire. The Atlanteans had divine blood in their veins, the legacy of Poseidon's union with a mortal woman named Cleito. For generations, that divine inheritance kept them virtuous. They ruled justly, shared their wealth, honored the gods. But over time, the divine portion grew thin. Human nature took over. They became greedy, aggressive, corrupt. They looked at their neighbors and saw not allies but resources to be exploited. They assembled an enormous military force and prepared to conquer the entire Mediterranean world. Standing in their way was Athens. This is where Plato's story takes on a very specific political color. In his account, Athens, small, virtuous, organized according to principles of justice, defeats the massive Atlantean invasion through courage and superior virtue. It's a David and Goliath tale, but with a clear message about what makes a society strong. And then comes the catastrophe. Zeus, watching from Olympus, sees how far the Atlanteans have fallen. He decides to punish them. In a single day and night of violent earthquakes and floods, Atlantis sinks beneath the waves. The entire island, the great city, the proud empire, gone, swallowed by the sea. Plato gives us a timestamp for this destruction. He says it happened 9,000 years before Solon's visit to Egypt. That would place the catastrophe around 9,600 BC, deep in the last ice age, long before any of the civilizations Plato knew anything about. And that's where the story ends. The dialogue Critias breaks off mid-sentence, literally unfinished. We never get Plato's full account. We're left with fragments, hints, a narrative that stops before it can explain itself. Now here's what matters. For almost his entire career, Plato wrote stories about imaginary places. In the Republic, he describes an ideal city-state that exists only in theory, a thought experiment about justice. No one mistakes that for a historical document. It's obviously a teaching tool, a way to explore political philosophy through narrative. But with Atlantis, Plato does something different. He frames it as history, ancient history, passed down through specific named sources. He includes precise details about its size, layout, and destruction. He even has Critias insist multiple times that this is a true story, not a made-up tale. So which is it? A parable about the corrupting nature of power, dressed up as history to make it more compelling, or a garbled account of something that really happened, filtered through centuries of oral tradition until it became unrecognizable? The answer matters because it determines how we read everything else. If Atlantis is pure invention, then searching for it is pointless, like digging up the Irish countryside looking for Narnia. But if there's a kernel of historical truth buried in Plato's story, then maybe, just maybe, we can trace it backward to something real. For 2,000 years, most scholars treated Atlantis as obvious fiction. Plato was a philosopher, not a historian. His dialogues were teaching tools. Case closed. But something strange happened in the late 1800s. Archaeologists started digging up cities that weren't supposed to exist. Heinrich Schliemann used Homer's Iliad, another text everyone assumed was pure mythology, to locate the real city of Troy. Arthur Evans uncovered an entire Bronze Age civilization on Crete that no one knew had existed. Suddenly, myths didn't look quite so mythical. If Homer's heroes fought at a real Troy, maybe Plato's Atlantis pointed to something real too. Maybe somewhere in the Mediterranean, there had been a powerful island civilization that vanished in a catastrophe. Maybe the details were wrong, the size, the location, the timeline, but the core event was genuine. That's when the search began in earnest. And what that search uncovered wasn't Atlantis, not exactly, but it was something almost as remarkable, a Bronze Age superpower that controlled trade across the Aegean, a volcanic eruption so violent it erased that civilization from history, and a chain of evidence connecting Plato's story to events that actually happened, just not where or when he said they did. Crete is the largest island in Greece, a long crescent of limestone mountains rising from the Mediterranean. In the early 1900s, it was considered a backwater, historically interesting because of its role in Greek mythology, but not particularly important to archaeologists. Then Arthur Evans started digging. Evans was a British archaeologist with independent wealth and a stubborn conviction that something important lay beneath the soil of Crete. In 1900, he purchased a site near the modern city of Heraclion, a place called Knossos that locals claimed had once held a palace. What he uncovered changed everything. The palace at Knossos wasn't Greek. It predated classical Greek civilization by more than 1,000 years. It was massive, covering nearly 6 acres, with over 1,000 interconnected rooms. The walls were decorated with frescoes showing scenes of extraordinary sophistication, bull leapers performing acrobatic feats, processions of people in elaborate dress, dolphins and flowers rendered in vivid color. The architecture itself was stunning, pillars tapered downward instead of upward, a distinctive style found nowhere else. Light wells brought sunshine deep into interior spaces. A complex plumbing system included flush toilets and stone pipes that carried water throughout the building. This was not a primitive society. Evans called them the Minoans, after the legendary king Minos, who supposedly ruled Crete in Greek mythology. Over the next several decades, as excavations continued at Knossos and other sites across Crete, the scale of their civilization became clear. The Minoans were a Bronze Age superpower. They controlled trade routes across the Aegean, established colonies on nearby islands, and maintained diplomatic contact with Egypt, Cyprus, and the Near East. Their pottery has been found from Sicily to Syria, evidence of a trading network that spanned the eastern Mediterranean. They were also wealthy in a way that few Bronze Age societies could match. The palaces at Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, and Zakros contained enormous storage facilities, rows upon rows of giant clay jars called pithoi, each one tall enough to hide a person inside. These jars held olive oil, wine, grain, the surplus wealth that funded everything else. But what really set the Minoans apart was their culture. Most Bronze Age civilizations were built on military might, fortified cities, armies, weapons production. The Minoans seemed different. Their cities had no defensive walls. Their art showed no battle scenes. Instead, their frescoes depicted religious rituals, athletic competitions, and scenes from nature. Women appeared prominently in their art, not as passive figures but as priestesses, athletes, leaders. Some scholars have suggested the Minoans might have been a matriarchal society, though that remains controversial. What's clear is that women held positions of power and religious authority. Their religion centered on a mother goddess, often shown holding snakes or standing on a mountain peak, attended by priestesses in elaborate robes. Bulls played a crucial role in their rituals, though not in the way you might expect. Minoan bull leaping was an athletic ceremony where young people, both male and female, would grab a charging bull by the horns and vault over its back, in a move that seems physically impossible until you see it depicted over and over in their art. This was a culture of ritual, not warfare, of trade, not conquest, of wealth built on commerce and agriculture, not plunder. And then, sometime around 1600 BC, something happened. The palaces show evidence of destruction, fire damage, collapsed walls, rooms buried in ash. Some were rebuilt, others were abandoned. And by 1450 BC, the Minoan civilization, as it had existed for over 1,000 years, was effectively over. What caused this collapse? For decades, archaeologists debated the answer. Some proposed invasion by mainland Greeks. Others suggested internal rebellion or economic collapse. But the evidence kept pointing in one direction, toward a small island about 70 miles north of Crete. An island that no longer exists. Today, if you sail north from Crete into the Aegean, you'll come to a cluster of islands arranged in a rough circle around a deep bay. The largest is Thera, also called Santorini, a crescent of white villages perched on black cliffs that drop straight into the sea. It's beautiful in a stark, almost alien way. But that circular arrangement isn't natural. It's the rim of a volcanic crater. A caldera formed when the center of the island collapsed inward during an eruption so massive it ranks among the largest in human history. The eruption of Thera happened sometime in the mid-2nd millennium BC, roughly contemporary with the destruction layers found in Minoan palaces. And as archaeologists began to understand the scale of that eruption, they realized it would have been catastrophic for anyone living in the Aegean. We're not talking about a normal volcanic event, not lava flows that people could outrun or ash clouds that would clear in a few days. This was a Plinian eruption, a volcanic event so powerful it ejects material into the stratosphere, and can affect climate across an entire hemisphere. To understand what happened at Thera, you need to understand how this type of eruption works. Deep beneath the island, magma had been accumulating for centuries, a massive chamber of molten rock under immense pressure. When that pressure finally exceeded the strength of the rock above it, the eruption began. First came the earthquakes, a warning that might have lasted hours or days, giving people time to evacuate. Then the initial explosion, as gas-charged magma blasted through the surface, sending a column of ash and pumice tens of thousands of feet into the air. This column would have been visible for hundreds of miles, a towering black pillar against the sky, lit from within by lightning as ash particles collided. Pumice rained down on the island and surrounding sea. On Thera itself, everything was buried under feet of volcanic material within hours. But the eruption didn't stop. As more and more material was ejected, the magma chamber began to empty. The rock above it, no longer supported, started to collapse. The eruption column lost its structure and fell back to Earth in what volcanologists call pyroclastic flows, avalanches of superheated gas and rock that move at hundreds of miles per hour. Nothing survives a pyroclastic flow, not people, not buildings, not vegetation. The temperature alone, often exceeding 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, incinerates everything organic. And then came the final phase, the caldera collapse. As the magma chamber emptied, the entire center of the island, an area of about 30 square miles, fell into the void left behind. The collapse created a crater over 1,000 feet deep, and when that much rock falls into the sea, that suddenly it displaces an enormous volume of water. Tsunami. Not one wave, but a series of them, radiating outward from Thera in all directions. Computer models suggest the waves might have reached heights of over 30 feet by the time they hit the northern coast of Crete. Coastal settlements would have been destroyed completely. And this is where the story starts to sound familiar. A powerful maritime civilization controlling trade across the Mediterranean, an island that vanishes in a volcanic catastrophe, cities buried, fleets destroyed, an entire culture effectively erased in a single event. Could this be what Plato was describing? Could the story of Atlantis actually be a distorted memory of the Minoan civilization and its destruction by the Thera eruption? The timeline doesn't match. Plato places Atlantis 9,000 years before his time, but the Minoans existed only about 1,000 years earlier. The location doesn't match. Plato puts Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Heracles in the Atlantic, not in the Aegean. And the scale doesn't match. Plato describes a continent-sized landmass, while Thera was never more than a small island. But what if those details got scrambled in transmission? What if Plato was working from a genuine historical memory that had been distorted by centuries of retelling? Numbers inflated, locations confused, details added or lost. This is the Minoan hypothesis, and as archaeologists dug deeper into the ruins of Thera itself, they found something that made the connection even more compelling. In 1967, a Greek archaeologist named Spiridon Marinatos began excavating a site on the southern coast of Thera. He was looking for evidence of the ancient settlement that must have existed there before the eruption. What he found exceeded every expectation. Beneath 40 feet of volcanic ash and pumice lay an entire Bronze Age town, perfectly preserved. The site is called Akrotiri, and it's one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. Not because of what it tells us about Atlantis, though we'll get to that, but because of what it reveals about life in the Aegean 3,500 years ago. Akrotiri wasn't a palace. It was an ordinary town, if ordinary is the right word for a place this sophisticated. The buildings were multi-story structures made of cut stone and timber, some standing over 20 feet tall. The walls were plastered and painted with frescoes that rival anything found on Crete. The streets were paved. There was a drainage system. Individual houses had indoor plumbing. ceramic pipes bringing fresh water in and carrying wastewater out. This is Bronze Age infrastructure that wouldn't be matched in Europe again until Roman times. But what makes Akrotiri truly remarkable are the frescoes. Because the town was buried so quickly, and because volcanic ash creates an oxygen-free environment that prevents decay, the paintings were preserved in extraordinary detail. We're not talking about fragments or faded images. We're talking about room-sized murals still showing the full range of their original colors. One fresco shows two young boys boxing, their bodies rendered in careful anatomical detail. Another depicts a fisherman returning with his catch. You can count the individual fish, identify the species. A third shows a fleet of ships traveling between coastal cities, the oarsmen visible through the ship's hulls, dolphins leaping in the water around them. These aren't stylized religious images. They're scenes from daily life, painted by artists who understood perspective, anatomy, and narrative composition. The level of artistic sophistication is startling, especially for a provincial town on a small island. But here's what's most striking about Akrotiri. There are no bodies. At Pompeii, when Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD, the residents were caught by surprise. The excavations there uncovered thousands of people who died where they fell, preserved as hollow spaces in the ash that could be filled with plaster to create haunting casts of their final moments. Akrotiri has none of that. No bodies, no jewelry left behind in the panic, no valuables abandoned in the rush to escape. The town was systematically evacuated before the eruption destroyed it. This tells us something important about the sequence of events. The eruption didn't happen without warning. There must have been precursor earthquakes, maybe days or weeks of seismic activity that convinced the inhabitants to leave while they still could. They took everything valuable with them. Then they got on ships and sailed away, probably to Crete or other nearby islands. They must have watched from a distance as their home was buried beneath ash and stone. So they survived, at least the initial eruption, but survival didn't mean safety. When Thera erupted, it ejected an estimated 24 cubic miles of material into the atmosphere. That's 4 times the volume of the Krakatoa eruption in 1883, which killed over 30,000 people and lowered global temperatures for years. The ash from Thera has been found in ice cores from Greenland and in sediment layers across the eastern Mediterranean. Anyone living on islands downwind of the eruption would have been buried under volcanic fallout. The ash would have poisoned water supplies, destroyed crops, made the air dangerous to breathe. The tsunami would have devastated coastal settlements across the Aegean. And then there's the climate impact. Volcanic eruptions this large inject sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, where it forms a fine mist that reflects sunlight back into space. The result is a volcanic winter, a period of cooler temperatures and disrupted weather patterns that can last for years. For an agricultural society like the Minoans, this would have been catastrophic. Failed harvests, famine, economic collapse, all the cascading failures that follow when the food supply disappears. But here's where the story gets complicated. The archaeological evidence from Crete shows destruction layers that seem to match the eruption timeline. Palaces burned, settlements abandoned, a clear break in the material culture. But the destruction wasn't immediate. Some sites show signs of damage from earthquake or tsunami, followed by rebuilding, and then final abandonment decades later. Others seem to have survived the eruption itself, only to fall to human invaders in the following years. The end of the Minoan civilization wasn't a single event. It was a process, a slow collapse triggered by natural disaster, but finished by human hands. Around 1450 BC, possibly decades after the Thera eruption, Knossos and other major Minoan sites show evidence of new inhabitants. The artifacts change, the pottery styles shift. Most tellingly, the writing changes from Minoan Linear A, still undeciphered, to Mycenaean Linear B, which we can read. The Mycenaeans were mainland Greeks, a warrior culture that would eventually become the civilization Homer wrote about. They were expanding their influence across the Aegean, And a weakened Crete must have looked like an opportunity. Whether they conquered the island through military force or simply moved into the power vacuum left by Minoan decline, the result was the same. By 1400 BC, Minoan civilization as an independent culture was effectively over. The palaces were either abandoned or occupied by Mycenaean administrators. The trade networks collapsed. The artistic traditions faded. But the memory lingered. The Greeks who came after, the classical Greeks of Plato's time, preserved stories about Crete's former glory. They remembered King Minos, who supposedly ruled a maritime empire and demanded tribute from Athens. They remembered the Minotaur, the bull-headed monster that lived in a labyrinth beneath the palace. These were myths by Plato's time, old stories that no one quite believed anymore, but they preserved fragments of historical truth. Minos might have been a title rather than a name, the Minoan equivalent of Pharaoh. The labyrinth might have been a memory of the palace at Knossos, with its hundreds of interconnected rooms. The Minotaur might have been a distorted recollection of bull-leaping ceremonies or religious imagery. And maybe, just maybe, Plato's story about Atlantis was another one of these distorted memories. A story about a powerful maritime civilization that vanished in a catastrophe, transmitted through Egyptian sources who had their own contacts with the Minoan world. But if that's true, we should be able to trace the story's path. We should be able to connect Plato to Egypt, Egypt to the Minoans, and find evidence that someone, somewhere, preserved a memory of what actually happened. Plato claimed his story came from Solon, who heard it from Egyptian priests. This chain of transmission is crucial. If Atlantis is just Plato's invention, the Egyptian connection is meaningless. But if there's genuine historical memory behind the story, then Egypt is where we should look for corroboration. So let's examine what we know. Solon was a real person, one of Athens' most famous lawmakers and poets, who lived around 600 BC. Ancient sources confirm that he traveled to Egypt, probably to the city of Sais in the Nile Delta. This was during the 26th dynasty, when Egypt was experiencing a cultural renaissance under rulers who deliberately looked back to earlier periods of Egyptian glory. Egyptian priests were the keepers of historical memory. They maintained temple records going back thousands of years, king lists, astronomical observations, records of floods and famines. If anyone in the ancient world would have preserved information about catastrophic events in the Mediterranean, it would be them. And Egypt definitely had contact with the Minoans. We have archaeological evidence of trade between Egypt and Crete, going back to at least 2000 BC. Minoan pottery has been found in Egyptian contexts. Egyptian goods, scarabs, gold jewelry, stone vessels appear in Minoan palaces. The two civilizations knew each other, traded with each other, probably had diplomatic relations. More than that, Egyptian texts mention a group of people they called the Keftiu, usually translated as Cretans. Tomb paintings from the reign of Thutmosis III show Keftiu ambassadors bringing gifts to the pharaoh. You can identify them by their distinctive clothing and the objects they carry, which match artifacts found on Crete. So Egypt knew about the Minoans. They had diplomatic and trade relationships. They would have noticed if that relationship suddenly ended. But did they record it? This is where we run into problems. No Egyptian text explicitly mentions the destruction of Crete or refers to anything that sounds like the Atlantis story. But that doesn't mean the information wasn't there. Most ancient texts haven't survived. What we have are fragments, inscriptions on stone that lasted because stone doesn't decay, papyrus documents that survived by accident in dry tombs, the temple archives that Solon would have seen, scrolls recording historical events, astronomical data, diplomatic correspondence. Those are gone. But there's a tantalizing hint in the timeline. The Thera eruption happened during Egypt's New Kingdom period, probably during the reign of Ahmose I or his successors. This was a time of transition. Egypt had just expelled foreign rulers called the Hyksos and was reasserting control over its territory. A massive volcanic eruption affecting the entire eastern Mediterranean would not have gone unnoticed. There's a text called the Tempest Stele from the reign of Ahmose. It describes a catastrophic storm that struck Egypt: darkness, destruction, flooding. Some scholars have suggested this might be a record of the atmospheric effects of the Thera eruption, the ash cloud, the darkened skies, the climate disruption. But the connection is speculative. The text doesn't mention Crete or islands sinking into the sea. It's a religious inscription, crediting the pharaoh with restoring order after divine chaos, standard propaganda. So we can't definitively prove that Egyptian priests preserved a detailed account of the Minoan catastrophe, but we can say this: they had the means, the motive, and the opportunity. They kept extensive historical records. They had diplomatic contact with the Minoans. They would have witnessed the effects of the eruption, the darkened skies, the disrupted weather, possibly even tsunami damage along their northern coast. And centuries later, when a Greek lawmaker came to Sais seeking knowledge, priests could have shared stories about ancient catastrophes in the islands to the north, stories that Solon brought back to Athens, stories that passed through his family until they reached Plato's cousin Critias, stories that Plato then used in his philosophical dialogues. But here's where the Minoan hypothesis starts to fracture. Because even if we accept that Plato was working from some historical memory of the Thera eruption, even if we grant that Egyptian sources preserved information about Minoan Crete, there's a fundamental problem with the timeline. Plato says Atlantis was destroyed 9,000 years before Solon's time. That places the catastrophe around 9,600 BC, the late Paleolithic, before agriculture, before cities, before any civilization we have archaeological evidence for. The Thera eruption happened around 1600 BC. That's 8,000 years too recent. Some scholars have suggested the number got corrupted in transmission. Maybe it was 900 years and a zero got added somewhere. Maybe the Egyptian priests used a different calendar system and Solon or Plato misunderstood the conversion. But this feels like special pleading. We're taking a specific, repeated claim in Plato's text and saying he got it wrong so we can make the story fit our preferred interpretation. And there's another problem with the timeline. Plato says that ancient Athens, the Athens that fought Atlantis, existed 9,000 years before his time. But we know from archaeology that Athens wasn't a significant settlement until the Bronze Age. The city Plato describes, with a military caste, organized government, defensive walls, didn't exist in 9,600 BC. So either Plato made up the entire story, timeline and all, or he was genuinely confused about when these events occurred, or he was using the Atlantis story as a frame for something else entirely, a philosophical argument about politics and hubris, dressed up with borrowed details from real Bronze Age civilizations. The Minoan hypothesis is compelling. It explains so many details in Plato's account: the maritime empire, the volcanic destruction, the connection to Egyptian records. But it can't explain the timeline without making assumptions about errors in transmission that we can't verify. So where does that leave us? With a story that might contain historical memory, but filtered through so many retellings that we can't separate fact from embellishment. With a real civilization that matches many details of Plato's description, but not the scale or timeline. With an eruption so catastrophic it must have left marks on human memory, but no clear proof that those marks included the specific story Plato told. To understand why this matters, why it's so hard to pin down exactly what Plato meant, we need to look at how oral tradition actually works, how stories change when they're passed down through generations, how catastrophic events get remembered, distorted, and ultimately transformed into something that serves the needs of the people telling the story. A city burns. The survivors scatter, some by ship, some overland, carrying what they can. That night, huddled in refugee camps or sailing toward unfamiliar shores, they tell their children what happened. This is the beginning of oral tradition. The first telling is still raw with detail. Street names, specific people, the smell of smoke, the sound of buildings collapsing. But already, even in that first retelling, the mind is starting to shape the story, emphasizing certain moments, glossing over others, searching for meaning in chaos. The children who hear that story grow up. They tell it to their own children, but now it's second-hand. The street names have been forgotten. Specific people become generic types. The brave soldier, the wise elder, the mother who saved her family. By the third or fourth generation, the story has become legend. Details that don't serve the narrative fall away. Details that resonate, that teach lessons or explain why things are the way they are, get amplified. This isn't lying or deliberate distortion. This is how human memory works when there's no writing to fix events in place. Anthropologists who study oral cultures have documented this process in detail. Stories about historical events do persist across generations, sometimes for hundreds of years, but they don't persist as accurate historical accounts. They persist as stories that do cultural work. A flood becomes a divine punishment for human wickedness. An invasion becomes a test of courage. A volcanic eruption becomes a battle between gods. The core event, water, war, fire, remains, but it gets wrapped in layers of meaning that help the community make sense of disaster. And numbers change. This is crucial for understanding the Atlantis timeline. In oral tradition, specific dates and measurements are the first things to go. 100 becomes 1,000. 1,000 becomes 10,000. Not because anyone is deliberately inflating numbers, but because large numbers function differently in oral culture. They're impressionistic markers of magnitude rather than precise quantities. When Homer says the Greek army at Troy had 1,000 ships, he's not conducting a census. He's saying a lot of ships, enough to make the story impressive. The specific number matters less than what it conveys about scale and importance. So when Plato says Atlantis existed 9,000 years earlier, we shouldn't treat that as a precise historical date. He's saying a very long time ago. So long ago that it's beyond living memory, beyond even historical record. The number serves a narrative function. It makes Atlantis ancient, lost, irretrievable. But this creates a problem for anyone trying to connect Plato's story to real events. If we can't trust the timeline, what can we trust? There's actually a methodology for this. When historians work with oral traditions, they look for what's called the narrative core, the basic structure of the story that remains consistent across different tellings. The details might change, but certain patterns repeat. In the Atlantis story, that core looks like this. A powerful maritime civilization becomes corrupt and aggressive. It threatens other peoples. The gods punish it with a catastrophic natural disaster. The civilization is destroyed in a single day and night. It sinks beneath the sea and is never seen again. That's the pattern we should be looking for in the archaeological record. Not a literal match for Plato's description, not an island beyond Gibraltar or a timeline stretching back 9,000 years, but a catastrophic end for a maritime power, dramatic enough to lodge in cultural memory. And here's where it gets interesting. The Thera eruption fits that pattern almost perfectly, except for scale and location. But there's another volcanic catastrophe that matches even more closely, one that happened much more recently and was witnessed by literate observers who left detailed accounts. Krakatoa, 1883 AD. When Krakatoa erupted between the Indonesian islands of Java and Sumatra, it produced one of the loudest sounds in recorded history. The explosion was heard over 3,000 miles away. The atmospheric pressure waves circled the globe 7 times. But what's most relevant to our story is what happened after. The eruption generated massive tsunamis, waves over 100 feet high that devastated coastal communities across the region. Over 36,000 people died, most of them drowned by the waves. Entire villages were erased, leaving nothing but empty shorelines. Survivors describe the experience in terms that sound eerily familiar. The sky darkened at noon. Ships were carried miles inland by the waves. Islands that had been visible from shore simply vanished, The land itself pulled beneath the water as the volcanic cone collapsed. If Krakatoa had happened in a pre-literate society, if there had been no newspapers, no telegraph, no written records, what would the memory of that event look like 300 years later? Probably something very close to the Atlantis story, a land that sank beneath the waves in a day and night of fire and water, a catastrophe of divine magnitude, details inflated, timeline distorted, but the essential horror preserved in narrative form. This is how oral tradition transforms eyewitness accounts into myth, not by replacing truth with fiction, but by shaping truth into a form that can survive transmission across generations. And this brings us back to Plato. Maybe he really was working from a memory of the Thera eruption, a memory that had passed through Egyptian archives, through Solon, through his own family, but by the time it reached him, it had been filtered through centuries of retelling. The timeline had been distorted beyond recognition, the scale had been amplified, the location had shifted, maybe confused with other seafaring cultures, or deliberately moved beyond the known world to give the story mythic weight. But Plato didn't just pass along the story he received, he reshaped it for his own purposes. Because Plato wasn't writing history, he was writing philosophy, using stories as tools to explore ideas about justice, power, and the corruption of human nature. And that means we need to ask a different question. Not, did Atlantis exist? But why did Plato tell this particular story in this particular way? What was he actually trying to say? Athens in 360 BC was not the Athens of the Golden Age. 50 years earlier, the city had been the dominant power in Greece, leading a coalition of city-states, funding magnificent architecture, producing the plays and philosophy that would define Western culture. But then came the Peloponnesian War. For nearly 3 decades, Athens fought Sparta for supremacy. The war consumed resources, corrupted politics, and ultimately ended in Athenian defeat. The empire was dismantled, the navy destroyed, the city itself briefly ruled by a puppet oligarchy installed by Sparta. Democracy was restored, but it was damaged goods. The Democratic Assembly, the same body that had once made Athens great, had also voted for disastrous military adventures, persecuted innocent generals, and eventually condemned Socrates to death. Plato had watched all of this happen. As a young man, he'd witnessed his city's decline. He'd seen his teacher executed for asking uncomfortable questions. He'd come to believe that democracy itself was fundamentally flawed, that rule by the people inevitably led to rule by the mob, that popular opinion was no substitute for wisdom. His answer was philosophy. If Athens was going to rebuild itself, it needed to be guided by people who understood truth, justice, and the good, not just people who could give persuasive speeches. This is the project behind all of Plato's dialogues. He's not just recording philosophical debates, he's constructing a vision of how society should be organized, who should rule, how they should be educated, what values should guide their decisions. And Atlantis fits perfectly into that project. Look at how Plato structures the story. Atlantis starts as an ideal society, founded by a god, ruled by divine descendants, organized according to perfect principles. For generations, this system works beautifully. But then, corruption sets in. As the divine blood thins and human nature takes over, the Atlanteans become greedy, ambitious, militaristic. They look at their neighbors and see opportunities for conquest. This is exactly what Plato thought had happened to Athens. After the Persian Wars, Athens had emerged as the leading power in Greece. It formed the Delian League, supposedly a defensive alliance, but really an Athenian empire. Allied cities were forced to pay tribute, punished if they tried to leave, treated as subjects rather than partners. Athens became, in Plato's view, a tyrannical power, and when you become a tyrant, the universe has a way of correcting itself. In the Atlantis story, that correction comes through divine intervention. Zeus gathers the gods and decides to punish the Atlanteans for their corruption. The resulting catastrophe is both punishment and cleansing, wiping the slate clean so the world can start over without this corrupting influence. For Plato's audience, the parallel would have been obvious. Athens had overreached, become corrupt, and suffered catastrophic defeat. The story of Atlantis was a warning about what happens when power corrupts, even power that starts with the best intentions. But there's another layer to the story. Before Atlantis falls, it faces an enemy, ancient Athens. And this ancient Athens, mythical, idealized, organized according to the principles Plato had outlined in other dialogues, defeats the Atlantean invasion through virtue rather than military might. This is pure fantasy. There was no organized Athenian state in 9600 BC, but that's not the point. Plato is showing his students what Athens could be if it organized itself according to philosophical principles. A small state, virtuous and well-governed, capable of defeating a much larger empire through courage and moral superiority. It's a political lesson dressed up as ancient history. And this is why the question, did Atlantis exist, might be asking the wrong thing. Plato wasn't trying to write accurate history. He was trying to teach philosophy through narrative, using a story to explore ideas that would be dry and abstract if presented as pure theory. But he was also doing something more subtle. He was showing how stories work, how they shape the way people think about power, justice, and the relationship between human ambition and divine order. By framing Atlantis as ancient history, by having Critias insist it's a true story, not a made-up tale, Plato gives the narrative weight and authority. It forces his audience to engage with it differently than they would with an obvious fiction. But he also leaves clues that he's not being entirely serious. The dialogue breaks off mid-sentence, unfinished. The timeline is absurdly ancient. The geography is vague and contradictory. It's as if Plato is playing a game with his readers, presenting a story that sounds historical, but contains just enough impossibility to make you question whether you should take it literally. For 2,000 years, most scholars got the message. They treated Atlantis as philosophical allegory, interesting for what it revealed about Plato's thinking, not as a historical document. But starting in the late 1800s, something changed. As archaeology began uncovering lost civilizations, Troy, Mycenae, the Minoans, it became tempting to read Plato more literally. Maybe he really did have access to historical memories that modern scholarship had dismissed as myth. And once that door opened, Atlantis stopped being a philosophical problem and became an archaeological treasure hunt. People started searching for it, not just in the Aegean where the Minoan connection suggested, but everywhere. Antarctica, the Bahamas, Indonesia. Each new theory reinterpreted Plato's text to fit a preferred location, torturing the geography and timeline to make the pieces fit. The search for Atlantis became less about understanding what Plato actually wrote and more about projecting modern fantasies onto an ancient text. But beneath all that speculation and pseudoscience, there's still a legitimate question. If we strip away Plato's philosophical framing and the distortions of oral tradition, is there a real event at the core of this story? To answer that, we need to look at what actually happens when civilizations encounter catastrophe, how sudden destruction gets recorded, or doesn't, how the archaeological evidence of collapse sometimes tells a very different story than the myths that follow. There's a layer of black earth in the archaeological record of many Bronze Age sites. Sometimes it's ash from burning buildings. Sometimes it's soil that turned dark from accumulated organic decay after a site was abandoned. But whatever its composition, this layer represents the same thing: catastrophic disruption. Life before the layer, destruction. Life after the layer, different, diminished, sometimes absent entirely. Around 1200 BC, these destruction layers appear across the eastern Mediterranean. Not just one or two sites, but dozens. Palaces burn, cities are abandoned, trade networks collapse. This event, or series of events, is called the Bronze Age collapse. and it's one of the great mysteries of archaeology. Within a span of about 50 years, nearly every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean either collapsed or was severely weakened. The Mycenaean Greeks, the Hittite Empire, coastal cities in the Levant, all show evidence of violent destruction or abandonment. Egypt survived, barely, but Egyptian texts from this period describe invasions by mysterious groups they called the Sea Peoples. These weren't organized armies from a single nation. They were coalitions of displaced peoples, refugees, pirates, mercenaries, moving across the Mediterranean in waves, attacking and looting wherever they went. What caused this collapse? Scholars have proposed everything from climate change to earthquake storms to invasions from the north. The truth probably involves multiple factors: a perfect storm of environmental stress, political instability, and military conflict that overwhelmed the interconnected Bronze Age world. But here's what matters for our story. This collapse, this moment when civilization itself seemed to be ending, left almost no detailed historical record. The Mycenaeans had a writing system called Linear B. We can read it now. It's an early form of Greek. But when the palaces burned, literacy disappeared with them. For 3 centuries, what historians call the Greek Dark Ages, there's no written record at all from Greece. The archaeological evidence shows people still lived there, but in smaller communities, with simpler technology, no palaces or monumental architecture. And when writing finally returned to Greece around 800 BC, it was in a completely different form. The alphabet borrowed from Phoenicia. The people who wrote in this new script had no memory of Linear B, no direct knowledge of the Mycenaean civilization that had existed 400 years earlier. But they had stories. The Trojan War, as Homer tells it, seems to describe events from the late Bronze Age. The warriors use bronze weapons, ride chariots, fight from behind massive walls. The geography and many of the details match what we know about Mycenaean Greece. But Homer was composing around 750 BC, roughly 450 years after the Trojan War supposedly happened. The Iliad and Odyssey are the products of oral tradition, centuries of retelling that preserved a memory of the Bronze Age while completely transforming it. The heroes became superhuman. The battles became duels between champions instead of organized warfare. The gods became active participants, taking sides and intervening directly in human affairs. What had been history became myth. But the core remained, a memory of a time when Greek warriors sailed east and besieged a great city. That memory was real enough that Heinrich Schliemann could use it to locate the actual ruins of Troy. This is exactly the pattern we're looking for with Atlantis, a catastrophic event from the deep past, transmitted through oral tradition, emerging centuries later as a story that mixes history and fantasy in equal measure. And there's one more piece of evidence that makes this pattern even more compelling. Aboriginal Australians have oral traditions describing specific geographical features, islands, coastlines, valleys, that haven't existed since the end of the last ice age. These are stories passed down for over 10,000 years, describing landscapes that were submerged when sea levels rose after the glaciers melted. Scientists have been able to verify these stories by mapping the continental shelf. The geographical features described in the oral traditions actually exist, but under 300 feet of water. This proves that oral tradition can preserve accurate information across spans of time that seem impossible. Not every detail survives, and the stories accumulate layers of cultural meaning along the way. But the core memory, the event or place that sparked the story, can remain intact for millennia. So when Plato tells a story about an island that sank beneath the waves, we shouldn't automatically dismiss it as pure fiction. Somewhere in his sources, whether Egyptian records or Greek folklore or some combination, there might be a genuine memory of catastrophic subsidence. The question is, what actually sank? Islands don't usually sink, not in the way Plato describes. Here one day, gone the next, pulled beneath the waves by earthquake and flood. Most islands are essentially the tops of underwater mountains. They're made of rock that's firmly attached to the ocean floor. You can't just yank them down into the sea. But there are exceptions. Volcanic islands can collapse catastrophically when their magma chambers empty during eruptions. This is what happened at Thera. The center of the island fell into the void left by ejected magma, creating the caldera that exists today. From a distance, this would look like the island sinking. Land that had been above water, towns, harbors, fields, suddenly beneath the surface. The rim survives, but the center is gone. This is geologically possible and has happened multiple times in human history. Krakatoa did it in 1883, Thera did it around 1600 BC, and there are other volcanic islands in the Mediterranean that could potentially do the same thing. But there's another way islands can sink, not literally, but from a human perspective. Sea level rise. At the end of the last ice age, global sea levels rose by more than 300 feet as the glaciers melted. This didn't happen overnight. It took thousands of years, but the effect on coastal geography was dramatic. Low-lying areas that had been dry land became shallow seas. Islands were reduced to shoals. Coastal plains disappeared beneath the waves. For people living through this process, it would have been slow but relentless. Generation after generation watching the sea creep inland, familiar landmarks vanishing beneath the surf. This matches Plato's timeline better than the Thera eruption does. He places Atlantis 9,000 years before Solon, which would be around 9,600 BC, right in the middle of rapid post-glacial sea level rise. But there's a problem. In 9,600 BC, there were no cities, no maritime empires, no palace complexes or bronze gates. The people living then were hunter-gatherers, sophisticated in their own way, but not building the kind of civilization Plato describes. Unless our understanding of that period is incomplete. In 1994, a diver exploring the coast near Alexandria discovered massive stone blocks beneath the water. They turned out to be ruins from ancient Alexandria, parts of the royal quarter, including Cleopatra's palace, that had sunk due to earthquakes and subsidence over 2,000 years. The Mediterranean Sea is littered with sunken ruins, port facilities from Roman times, Greek harbors, Phoenician settlements, all underwater now because of sea level changes, earthquakes, or subsidence. Some of these were major cities in their time. If we didn't have historical records telling us they existed, we might never have found them. So here's an uncomfortable question. What if there are Bronze Age sites, or even earlier, that sank before anyone wrote about them? Sites that would change our understanding of when and where complex societies emerged. This is where legitimate archaeology ends and speculation begins, because the ocean floor has been mapped fairly thoroughly now, using sonar and other technologies. If there were massive sunken cities in accessible areas, we'd probably have found them. But probably isn't certainly. In 2000, marine archaeologists discovered a large structure off the coast of western Cuba, geometric formations that look almost architectural when viewed on sonar. They're at a depth of about 2,000 feet, which would mean they were submerged either impossibly long ago or by some catastrophic event. Most geologists think they're natural formations, interesting shapes created by current and erosion, but not human-made. Without more extensive study, it's impossible to know for sure. This is the problem with underwater archaeology. It's expensive, dangerous, and technically difficult. You can't just dig like you would on land. You need specialized equipment, trained divers, and careful planning. So vast areas of the ocean floor remain unexplored in any meaningful archaeological sense. Could there be ruins down there we haven't found yet? Ruins that might match some element of the Atlantis story? Possibly, but possibly is a very weak foundation for historical claims. What we need is positive evidence, something that actually points to a specific location or time period rather than just leaving the question open. And surprisingly, that evidence might exist, not in the Mediterranean, but in the Atlantic itself, exactly where Plato said Atlantis would be. The Strait of Gibraltar is only 9 miles wide at its narrowest point. On a clear day, you can stand on the European side and see Africa across the water. The ancient Greeks called this strait the Pillars of Heracles, the edge of the known world. Beyond it lay the Atlantic Ocean, largely unexplored, filled with unknown dangers. And this is where Plato specifically places Atlantis, not in the Mediterranean, where the Minoans lived, but beyond the strait in the Atlantic itself. For most scholars, this detail alone proves Atlantis couldn't be Minoan Crete. Plato is explicit about the location, an island in the Atlantic Ocean, larger than Libya and Asia combined. No amount of textual reinterpretation can move it into the Aegean. So what lies beyond the pillars that might match Plato's description? The ocean floor west of Gibraltar shows something remarkable. About 1,000 miles offshore, there's an underwater mountain range running roughly north to south, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. This ridge marks the boundary between tectonic plates, where new oceanic crust is constantly being formed. Parts of this ridge rise close enough to the surface to form islands. Iceland is the most famous example, and there are seamounts, underwater mountains that don't quite break the surface today, but might have been islands during the Ice Age, when sea levels were lower. In the 1960s and 70s, a few researchers became fascinated by this possibility. What if the Mid-Atlantic Ridge had supported a large island during the last Ice Age? An island that sank as sea levels rose, leaving only the mountaintops visible as the Azores? The problem is geology. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge is geologically active. New rock is being created there constantly as magma wells up from below, but the rock is young, recently formed. If there had been a large island there during the Ice Age, let alone during Plato's more ancient timeline, we should find older rock formations. We don't. Core samples from the ridge show exactly what you'd expect from an active spreading center, young volcanic rock, nothing that could support an ancient landmass. So the Atlantic itself doesn't offer any geological candidates for Atlantis. No sunken continent, no massive island that disappeared. But there's another possibility that's more intriguing. What if beyond the Pillars of Heracles wasn't meant as a literal geographical description, but as a narrative device, a way of saying, far away, beyond the edge of what we know? In Greek literature, the world beyond the pillars represented the realm of mystery and legend. It's where heroes went on impossible quests, where strange peoples lived, where the normal rules didn't apply. By placing Atlantis there, Plato removes it from the realm of verifiable history. You can't check his story against known geography because he's put it somewhere deliberately unreachable. This interpretation makes sense if Atlantis is pure fiction, but it creates problems if there's any historical basis to the story. Because here's what's interesting about oral tradition and geography. Locations do shift in transmission, but they usually shift toward the fantastic rather than toward the mundane. A real place that was destroyed might get relocated to the edge of the world in retelling, moved beyond the pillars or to the ends of the earth as the story becomes more mythic. This process makes sense psychologically. The more distant and unreachable a place becomes in the story, the more mythic weight it can carry. So Plato's Atlantic location might actually be evidence of the story's age and transformation. If Atlantis began as a memory of Minoan Crete, or some other Mediterranean civilization, centuries of retelling could have pushed it westward, beyond the known world. But there's one more Atlantic theory worth considering, one that doesn't require sunken continents or geological impossibilities. Just beyond the Pillars of Heracles, on the Atlantic coast of what's now Morocco, there are remains of ancient settlements, Carthaginian trading posts, Phoenician colonies, indigenous cultures that had extensive maritime traditions. Some of these settlements were destroyed by earthquakes and tsunamis over the centuries. The region sits on a seismically active zone where the African and Eurasian plates meet. Coastal cities there have been repeatedly damaged by geological events throughout history. Could one of these coastal settlements, destroyed catastrophically, remembered in local tradition, have contributed to the Atlantis story? Could Egyptian records have preserved accounts of Atlantic trade disrupted by disaster? It's possible, but the timeline still doesn't work, and there's no archaeological evidence of anything matching the scale Plato describes. Which brings us back to the fundamental question: are we looking for a specific place that matches Plato's description in every detail? Or are we looking for the catastrophic event or pattern of events that inspired the story, even if the details have been transformed beyond recognition? Step back from the details for a moment. Stop trying to match Plato's text to specific archaeological sites. Look instead at the pattern itself. A powerful civilization becomes corrupt. The gods punish it with catastrophic destruction. The civilization vanishes, leaving only memory. This pattern appears over and over in human mythology. The biblical flood, God punishing human wickedness by destroying the world with water, saving only Noah and his family. The story appears in Mesopotamian myth centuries before the Bible, and in flood legends from cultures around the world. Sodom and Gomorrah, cities destroyed by fire from heaven because of their inhabitants' sins. Lot's wife turned to salt for looking back, a warning against nostalgia for the corrupt past. The Tower of Babel, human ambition reaching too high, punished by divine intervention that scatters humanity and confuses their language. A story about the dangers of hubris dressed up as history. The pattern is consistent. Humans overreach. The divine order reasserts itself through catastrophe. The old world ends so a new one can begin. Atlantis fits this pattern perfectly. It's a cautionary tale about power and corruption, with divine punishment as the punchline. So maybe we shouldn't be looking for the event that inspired Atlantis. Maybe Atlantis is a composite, a story that aggregates multiple historical catastrophes into a single narrative. Volcanic destruction from Thera, sea level rise flooding coastal settlements, the Bronze Age collapse and the end of palace civilizations, tsunami damage from earthquakes in seismically active regions. All of these events happened, all left traces in historical memory, and all could have contributed to a general cultural memory of catastrophic destruction that Plato shaped into the Atlantis story. This interpretation is less satisfying than finding a lost city. It doesn't give us a specific location to explore or a clear historical event to point to. But it might be closer to the truth. Because the real power of the Atlantis story isn't in its historical accuracy, it's in what it reveals about how humans process collective trauma. Catastrophes happen: earthquakes, eruptions, floods, wars, collapse. The survivors need to make sense of them, to fit them into a framework that allows life to continue. And one way to do that is through stories that explain why it happened and what it means. Stories that turn random disaster into meaningful punishment, that suggest the world operates according to principles even when everything seems chaotic. Atlantis becomes a story about justice. The powerful who abuse their power will be brought down. The gods, or fate, or history, or however you want to frame the moral order, are watching. This is why the story has endured for over 2,000 years, not because people believe there's literally a lost city waiting to be found, but because the story speaks to something fundamental about power and its limits. Every empire thinks it's invincible. Every dominant power believes its supremacy will last forever, and everyone eventually falls to internal corruption, external enemies, environmental change, or some combination of factors. Atlantis is a reminder that this pattern is not new. It's as old as civilization itself. Despite all the evidence suggesting Atlantis is fiction or composite memory, people keep searching. Hundreds of locations have been proposed over the centuries. The Azores in the Atlantic, Antarctica, before it was covered in ice, the Bahamas, where underwater formations called the Bimini Road sparked speculation about ancient construction. Spain's Doñana National Park, where satellite imagery revealed circular formations that some claimed matched Plato's description. The island of Spartel, off Morocco's coast, which was above water during the Ice Age. Even Ireland, based on a creative reinterpretation of Plato's measurements and directions. Each new theory reinterprets the text in a way that supports the proposed location. Plato's stade becomes a different unit of measurement. The Pillars of Heracles get moved to different straits. The timeline gets adjusted, sometimes compressed, sometimes expanded. This is what's called motivated reasoning, starting with a conclusion and then finding ways to make the evidence fit. Real archaeology works the other direction. You examine evidence without preconceptions, see what patterns emerge, and then develop interpretations that best explain what you've found. And when archaeologists look at the actual evidence, the ruins, the artifacts, the geological record, they don't find anything that requires Atlantis to explain it. The Minoans explain themselves through the archaeological record from Crete and the Aegean. The Thera eruption is documented in volcanic deposits and ice cores. The Bronze Age collapse has its own complex causes rooted in climate, economics, and political instability. None of these phenomena need a lost Atlantic civilization to make sense. But that hasn't stopped the search, because the search isn't really about archaeology. It's about something deeper. The desire to believe there was once a golden age, a time when humans achieved something glorious that was then lost. This desire runs through human culture like a thread. The Garden of Eden before the fall, the Golden Age in Greek mythology, before Zeus introduced suffering and labor, the perfect harmony that existed before some catastrophe broke the world. Psychologically, this makes sense. If the world feels broken now, and every generation seems to feel this to some degree, then maybe it was whole once. Maybe we lost something valuable, and if we could just find it again, we could fix what's wrong. Atlantis becomes a symbol of that lost perfection, a civilization that achieved heights we can barely imagine, then fell through its own hubris. The search for Atlantis is really a search for proof that such heights are possible, that humans once had knowledge or technology or social organization that we've since forgotten, that maybe we could reclaim it. This is why Atlantis has become tangled up with pseudoscience and conspiracy theories. Claims about ancient advanced technology, sometimes attributed to aliens or lost civilizations. Theories that mainstream archaeology is suppressing evidence of Atlantis because it would overturn accepted timelines. These claims are almost always based on misunderstandings of archaeological evidence or outright fabrications, but they persist because they offer something appealing, a sense that there's hidden knowledge waiting to be rediscovered, that the official story is incomplete. The truth is both more mundane and more interesting. We don't need a lost Atlantis to appreciate human achievement in the ancient world. The Minoans built sophisticated palaces with advanced plumbing. The Egyptians constructed pyramids that still stand after 4,500 years. The Romans engineered aqueducts and roads that shaped European geography for millennia. These aren't mysteries requiring supernatural explanations. They're examples of what humans can accomplish with organization, knowledge, and determination. And they're what actually inspired stories like Atlantis, real achievements by real civilizations, filtered through time until they became legendary. The question isn't whether Atlantis existed. The question is what its story tells us about how we remember our own past and what we're afraid of losing in our future. There's a fresco from Akrotiri that archaeologists call the ship procession. It shows a fleet of ships traveling between two cities, painted in exquisite detail across an entire wall. You can see individual oarsmen, passengers sitting under awnings, dolphins leaping in the water. The cities themselves are remarkable. Multi-story buildings, cheering crowds, a level of urban sophistication that matches anything from classical Greece 1,000 years later. This fresco was painted around 1600 BC. The artist who created it lived in a world we can barely access, a Bronze Age civilization at its height, trading across the Mediterranean, worshipping gods whose names we don't even know. And then Thera erupted. This artist's world ended. Not gradually, but catastrophically. The city buried, the culture disrupted, centuries of accumulated knowledge and traditions scattered or lost. If we didn't have archaeology to recover that fresco, what would we know about this world? Probably nothing, or at best, garbled stories, myths about a golden age, legends of cities that vanished, half-remembered catastrophes transformed into tales of divine punishment. This is what Atlantis might actually be. Not a specific place, but a type of place. A memory of sophisticated Bronze Age cultures that existed before writing could fully document them. Cultures that were wealthy, artistic, technologically advanced by the standards of their time. Cultures that controlled trade networks, built impressive architecture, created art that still moves us today. Cultures that ended suddenly, through volcanic eruption, earthquake, invasion, or the slow cascade of systems breaking down. The survivors of these catastrophes carried memories forward. They told their children about the cities that once existed, the wealth that was lost, the way the world used to be before everything changed. Those memories got passed down through generations. They mixed with other memories, other catastrophes. They absorbed moral lessons, explanations for why the disaster happened, warnings about hubris and divine punishment. Eventually, those memories reached people like Plato, philosophers living centuries after the events, trying to make sense of stories that no longer had clear historical context. And Plato did what philosophers do. He shaped the raw material of myth into something that could teach lessons about justice, power, and the proper ordering of society. He wasn't lying about Atlantis. He was doing what humans have always done with catastrophic memory, transforming it into story, story into meaning, meaning into wisdom that might prevent the same mistakes from happening again. But here's the thing about catastrophe memory. It never really prevents anything. Every generation thinks it's learned from the past, that it won't make the same mistakes. And every generation builds its own version of Atlantis, a civilization that seems invincible until it isn't. The Romans thought their empire would last forever. The Byzantines believed God himself guaranteed their survival. The British Empire claimed the sun would never set on its territories. All gone now. Not always destroyed in a single catastrophic moment like Plato's Atlantis, but ended nonetheless. And when they ended, they left behind their own myths, stories about how great they once were, how they fell through corruption or betrayal or forces beyond their control, stories that future generations would puzzle over, trying to separate fact from nostalgic fiction. This is the real lesson of Atlantis. Not that there was once a perfect civilization that we need to rediscover, but that every civilization thinks it's permanent, and none of them are. The search for Atlantis is really a search for certainty in an uncertain world, a desire to prove that human achievement can reach such heights that it becomes immortal. But the archaeological record tells a different story. Civilizations rise, flourish, and fall, sometimes slowly, sometimes suddenly. Sometimes they leave impressive ruins, sometimes almost nothing at all. What survives is memory, and memory is always unreliable, always shaped by the needs of those doing the remembering. So when we ask, did Atlantis exist? We're really asking several questions at once. Did a specific place matching Plato's description exist? Almost certainly not. The geography, timeline, and scale don't match anything in the archaeological record. Did catastrophic events destroy Bronze Age civilizations in ways that might have inspired the story? Absolutely. The Thera eruption, the Bronze Age collapse, countless earthquakes and tsunamis that reshaped the Mediterranean world. Did Plato have access to genuine historical memories that he incorporated into his philosophical dialogues? Possibly, though those memories would have been so transformed by centuries of retelling that their original form is irrecoverable. And does the story of Atlantis tell us something true about human civilization and its fragility? Yes, that's the answer that matters most. There's a layer of ash and ice cores from Greenland. It sits at a depth corresponding to approximately 1600 BC, preserved in ice that fell as snow 3,600 years ago. Chemical analysis of this ash shows it came from the Mediterranean, specifically from the Thera eruption. The eruption was so massive that its signature appears in climate records across the northern hemisphere. This is how geology gives us certainty where texts cannot. We know the eruption happened. We can measure its scale from the volume of ejected material. We can trace its atmospheric impact through ice cores and tree ring records. We can date it, not to the exact year, because Bronze Age chronology is complicated, but to within a few decades. The geology doesn't lie. It can't be reinterpreted to fit a preferred narrative. The ash is there, in measurable quantities, at a specific depth in the ice. And this is what makes the Minoan hypothesis compelling, even though it can't be definitively proven. We have geological evidence of a catastrophic event that would have devastated the most advanced civilization in the Aegean. We have archaeological evidence of that civilization's subsequent decline. What we don't have is a clear textual record connecting the eruption to the Atlantis story. That connection requires inference, reading between the lines of Plato's text, assuming distortions in oral transmission, accepting that details like location and timeline could have been scrambled. But there's other geological evidence worth considering. The Mediterranean is one of the most seismically active regions on Earth. The African plate is slowly sliding beneath the Eurasian plate in a process called subduction. This creates earthquakes, volcanoes, and sudden changes in land elevation. Coastal subsidence, land sinking relative to sea level, is common here. Not the dramatic overnight collapse Plato describes, but steady sinking over decades or centuries. The ancient port of Ephesus in Turkey is now several miles inland. Parts of Alexandria are underwater. The Roman port of Baiae, near Naples, sits beneath 20 feet of water due to volcanic subsidence. These are documented cases of important settlements being lost to geological processes. None of them are Atlantis. They're too recent, too well documented, too small in scale. But they show that the basic premise of Plato's story, land sinking beneath the sea, is geologically plausible. The question is whether any such event happened on a scale large enough and early enough to inspire the Atlantis legend. Some researchers have looked at sea level changes at the end of the Ice Age. Between 12,000 BC and 6,000 BC, global sea levels rose over 300 feet. This was gradual by human standards, a few inches per generation, but relentless. Low-lying coastal areas that had been inhabited for thousands of years were slowly drowned. River valleys became estuaries, islands became shoals. Entire landscapes disappeared beneath the advancing sea. Could memory of this process have contributed to the Atlantis story? It's theoretically possible. We know that oral traditions can preserve geographical information across millennia. The Aboriginal Australian examples prove that. But there's a problem with the Ice Age flooding hypothesis. The people living then weren't building the kind of civilization Plato describes. They were hunter-gatherers, living in small bands, without cities or palaces or maritime empires. Their loss of coastal territory would have been significant to them, forcing migrations, disrupting traditional hunting grounds, but it wouldn't have looked anything like the fall of a great civilization. Unless we're missing something in the archaeological record. This is where speculation tends to go off the rails. The idea that there might have been an advanced Ice Age civilization that left no trace except in myth. The problem with this theory is simple: absence of evidence. Advanced civilizations leave traces, tools, buildings, graves, middens, all the material culture that archaeologists use to reconstruct past societies. We have extensive evidence of human activity going back tens of thousands of years. We can track the gradual development of technology, stone tools becoming more sophisticated, the invention of pottery, the domestication of plants and animals. There's no sudden appearance of advanced technology that would suggest a lost civilization. No gap in the record where something should be but isn't. just the slow, uneven progress of human innovation. So the geological evidence gives us this. Catastrophic events definitely happened in the Mediterranean during the Bronze Age and earlier. Volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, tsunamis, coastal subsidence, all documented in the physical record. These events would have been traumatic for the people who experienced them, traumatic enough to lodge in cultural memory and be retold for generations. But geology alone can't tell us whether any specific event inspired the Atlantis story. That requires connecting geological evidence to textual evidence and archaeological evidence, 3 different types of data that often don't align neatly. There's something humbling about studying Atlantis, not because it's a mystery that can't be solved, though it is that, but because it reveals how little we can know with certainty about the distant past. We have Plato's text. We have archaeological evidence of Bronze Age civilizations. We have geological evidence of catastrophic events. But connecting these 3 types of evidence requires making assumptions about how oral tradition works, about what Plato intended, about which details are historically reliable and which are elaborations. Every interpretation of Atlantis rests on a foundation of maybe. Maybe the timeline got distorted in transmission. Maybe the location shifted. Maybe Plato combined multiple sources into a single narrative. These maybes aren't necessarily wrong. Oral traditions do distort details over time. Authors do combine sources. Numbers and locations do shift in retelling. But each assumption moves us further from certainty. The more adjustments we make to Plato's text to fit it to a historical event, the less confident we can be that we're actually explaining what Plato wrote. This is the fundamental problem with the Minoan hypothesis. It requires us to say, Plato got almost everything wrong, the timeline, the location, the scale, but he got the core event right. That's possible, but it's not provable. And this gets at something important about how we study the past. History isn't like science, where you can run experiments and test hypotheses. You can't rerun the past to see what happens differently under changed conditions. All you can do is examine the evidence that survived, which is always incomplete, and construct narratives that seem to explain it. Different narratives can fit the same evidence equally well. For Atlantis, we have at least 3 narratives that are internally consistent. First, Atlantis is pure fiction. Plato invented it as a philosophical thought experiment, perhaps borrowing some details from real Bronze Age civilizations, but creating the essential story from imagination. This explains why the timeline and geography don't match anything in the historical record. It explains why Plato's story fits so perfectly into his philosophical project. And it requires the fewest assumptions. No lost records, no distortions in transmission, no need to reinterpret the text. Second, Atlantis is a distorted memory of the Minoan civilization and the Thera eruption. The core event is real, but centuries of oral transmission scrambled the details beyond recognition. This explains the striking parallels between Plato's description and what we know about Minoan Crete. It explains why the story emphasizes volcanic destruction and maritime power. But it requires us to accept that nearly every specific detail, timeline, location, scale, is wrong. Third, Atlantis is a composite, a story that aggregates multiple catastrophes and cultures into a single narrative. Elements from the Minoans, from other Bronze Age civilizations, from post-glacial sea level rise, all blended together. This explains why some details seem to match real events while others don't. It explains the mythic quality of the story, how it feels like it should be based on something real, even though no single real event matches it completely. All 3 of these narratives are plausible. None can be proven with the evidence available. And that's frustrating for people who want definitive answers. It's why the search for Atlantis continues despite scholarly consensus that it's probably not a real place. Because a mystery without a solution feels unfinished. We want closure, certainty, proof. But maybe the lack of certainty is the point. Maybe Atlantis is valuable precisely because we can't pin it down, because it sits in that ambiguous space between history and myth, forcing us to think about how we know what we know, about the limits of evidence, the fragility of memory, the way stories shape our understanding of the past, even when we can't verify their truth. Let's say we found it tomorrow. Some team of underwater archaeologists discovers ruins on the seabed that match Plato's description in every detail. Bronze gates, concentric rings of water and land, temples to Poseidon. What would change? We'd have to rewrite some textbooks. Plato would be vindicated as a more reliable historical source than scholars gave him credit for. Our understanding of Bronze Age civilization would expand, assuming this Atlantis dated to a period when complex societies existed. But it wouldn't fundamentally alter our understanding of human history. We already know that sophisticated civilizations existed in the Bronze Age. We already know they were vulnerable to catastrophic collapse. One more example, however spectacular, wouldn't change those basic facts. So why does Atlantis matter if finding it wouldn't really change anything? Why has it captivated human imagination for 2 millennia? Because Atlantis isn't really about the past. It's about the present and the future. Every generation reads Atlantis as a story about themselves. For Plato's students, it was a warning about Athenian imperial ambitions. For Renaissance thinkers, it was proof that ancient wisdom existed before the classical Greeks. For Victorian archaeologists, it was a potential real civilization waiting to be discovered. For New Age mystics, it became a source of lost spiritual knowledge. For science fiction writers, a setting for adventures about ancient technology. For climate scientists, a cautionary tale about environmental catastrophe. The story is flexible enough to accommodate all these interpretations. It can be whatever we need it to be: warning, inspiration, mystery, metaphor. And what we need it to be right now, in our current moment, is a reminder about the fragility of complex systems. We live in a civilization more interconnected and complex than anything the ancient world could have imagined. Global supply chains, digital communication, financial systems that span continents. This complexity creates efficiency and prosperity, but it also creates vulnerability. The Bronze Age collapse happened because the Mediterranean world had become too interconnected. When trade routes failed, when climate shifted, when invasions disrupted the network, everything fell apart together. Cities that depended on imported grain starved. Craftsmen who depended on imported copper and tin couldn't make bronze. Palaces that depended on tribute from subject territories couldn't pay their soldiers or priests. The system collapsed not because any one part failed, but because all the parts were connected. Failure cascaded through the network until nothing was left but ruins. We're more connected now than the Bronze Age world ever was, which means we're more vulnerable to cascade failures. Climate change disrupting agriculture, pandemics shutting down global commerce, cyber attacks crippling infrastructure, resource depletion forcing conflicts over what remains. The specific threats are different, but the pattern is the same. A complex civilization becomes vulnerable to shocks it can't absorb. And when those shocks come, not if, but when, the collapse can be surprisingly rapid. This is what Atlantis is really about. Not whether a specific city sank beneath the waves 3,000 years ago, but whether our own civilization is as permanent as we like to believe. Plato's Atlanteans thought they were invincible. They had wealth, technology, military power. What could possibly threaten them? And then, in a day and a night, gone. We like to think we're different. We have science, we have data, we can see threats coming and prepare for them. But the Minoans had science too. Their architecture, their plumbing, their maritime technology were all cutting edge for their time. Knowledge didn't save them when Thera erupted. The Romans had engineering marvels that wouldn't be matched for 1,000 years, didn't prevent their collapse. Every advanced civilization in history has believed it found the formula for permanence. Every single one eventually proved itself wrong. So the search for Atlantis, the desire to prove it existed, to find its ruins, to understand what happened, is really a search for answers to questions about our own future. Can civilizations be permanent, or is collapse inevitable? If Atlantis was real and we could understand why it fell, could we avoid the same fate? These are the real questions the story asks, and they don't have comfortable answers. Imagine walking through Akrotiri, not the excavated ruins that tourists visit today, but the living city as it existed 3,600 years ago. Morning sunlight streaming through windows, the smell of bread baking, children's voices echoing in the streets. You'd see merchants arguing over prices, artisans painting frescoes, priests conducting rituals in temples, ships in the harbour loading cargo for the voyage to Crete or Egypt. All of it ordinary, all of it permanent, as far as anyone knew. And then the earthquakes begin. First just tremors, unnerving but manageable, then stronger, plaster cracking, pottery falling from shelves. People make decisions, pack what can be carried, leave what cannot, get to the ships before it's too late. They sail away, looking back at their city one last time, and then the mountain explodes. That city, their home, their ancestors' graves, their temples and markets and everything familiar, buried beneath ash in hours. The world they knew ended. They become refugees. Some reach Crete, some scatter to other islands. They tell their children what happened, what was lost. Those children tell their children. The story passes through generations, changing with each telling. The eruption becomes divine punishment. The city becomes grander in memory than it was in life. The timeline stretches, the location shifts, details blur and merge with other stories. Eventually, it reaches Athens. A philosopher hears it and sees how it can teach lessons about power and hubris. He writes it down, not as history, but as philosophy, and in writing it down, he makes it immortal. 2,000 years later, we're still talking about it, still searching for it, still arguing about what it means. Did Atlantis exist? In a sense, yes, as a story that carries real historical memory forward through time, as a warning about what happens when civilizations become corrupt and overreach, as a reminder that nothing human-made is permanent. But as a specific place with bronze gates and concentric harbors, probably not. And maybe that's the perfect ending for this story. Not certainty, but mystery. Not answers, but better questions. Because the real Atlantis, if it ever existed, is gone beyond recovery, buried under ash, or beneath the sea, or simply lost to time. What remains is the story, and stories, unlike cities, can survive any catastrophe. They persist as long as there are people to tell them, as long as we need reminders about the fragility of everything we build. As long as we wonder whether we're living in our own age of Atlantis, brilliant, powerful, on the edge of something we can't quite see coming. The city beneath the waves stays there, but the questions it raises surface again and again. And maybe that's what Plato intended all along. Not to tell us about a lost city, but to make us think about the one we're building right now,